Well, I would like to welcome our speaker today, Angel Quintero Rivera. He's a professor and researcher from the Center of Social Studies of the University of Puerto Rico, Rio Piedras. He's the author or co-author of 12 books and numerous articles and monographs, and mainly they're centered on aspects of Caribbean and Puerto Rican society. His basic field is as a sociologist, and he studied in the early part of his career in the School of Economics in London. I think he was one of the first Puerto Rican scholars to go to London instead of Paris or some part of the United States, Madrid. And I think it was a decisive move. Even though his background is in sociology related to economic issues, and a lot of his early writings are related to such topics, he was in England at a time when there was a shift in interest, even among those primarily interested in the relationship between history and society and economics, to questions of culture. So that to understand the British working class, for example, you had to have an understanding of the development of British culture. And I sometimes call our guest the E.P. Thompson of Puerto Rican studies because E.P. Thompson was an important scholar of the English working class and the culture of the English working class. So while he was in London, there was an influence of another phenomenon happening in England at the time, which was the growth of the Birmingham School of Cultural Studies. And so while even in his most famous early book, which was called Patricios y Plebeos, Burgueses, Hacendados, Artesanos y Obreros, Las Relaciones de Clase en el Puerto Rico de Cambio de Siglo. The title of that book is Patricians and Plebeians, Burgueses or bourgeois, members of the bourgeoisie, owners of haciendas, artisans and obreros. Class relations in Puerto Rico at the beginning, at the turn of the century, which is also the time when Puerto Rico was occupied and taken by the United States, 1898. That book still has, although it's primarily a study of working class history, it has a lot of stuff on cultures. You can gather from the name of the artisans and the role of freed slaves, for example, as artisans in Puerto Rico. But the book that he's become most famous for in recent years is called Salsa, Sabor y Control, Sociología de la Música Tropical. Salsa, flavor and control, the sociology of tropical music. And it's a huge study of salsa and its roots and its implications for Caribbean society. And again, it's a continuation of his work on popular culture, the culture of working people, primarily in Puerto Rico. And that book won a major prize in Cuba, the Casa Las Americas Prize. It was also honored as the book of the year by the Latin American Studies Association. And he's also done books on religion. He's been working on a book on plastic arts in Puerto Rico, and he's just getting together a volume of a more extended volume on Caribbean music. And so those are very important things to say about him. The only other important thing I guess I'll say is that he was one of the founders for his generation of the Centro of the studies of Puerto Rican reality. And it was a group of young academics who were looking for other ways of understanding Puerto Rico that was away from the specific party politics in existence and views of that time. And they produced a whole generation of important intellectuals, the most famous of which, I believe, is with us today. And I'd like you to welcome Angel Quintero Rivera.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Mark. Well, I was thinking of sharing with you some ideas and some concerns regarding the study of the relationship between the Latin American popular culture, especially Hispanic Caribbean popular culture, and the United States culture, because usually these cultural interactions from the humanities point of view, they have been characterized by what Uruguayan intellectual José Enrique Rodó called this dichotomy of Ariel Caliban culture, which you will surely read later in your courses. So it places the Latin American culture and U.S. culture as sort of two antagonists and completely different cultures. From the social science point of view, there have always been also this dichotomy in terms of the culture that comes out from a society which is sort of in the dominant world, and the other sort of the subaltern world. But in the 1950s, more or less 60s, there was another perspective that came mostly from persons who were combining anthropology and history, and these were persons that began to speak of plantation America. And within that context, then the Hispanic Caribbean societies shared with Brazil and with some areas of the United States some processes as part of these plantation economies, which were mainly slave plantation originally. But it left out some other aspects of this fundamental part of our societies, which was, of course, the slave presence there. Some places like Cartagena in Colombia, which were very important for the slave history and slave economic history in the Americas, were not exactly plantation economies. They did another role in terms of other plantations areas of the Americas. But of course, we are in the Hispanic Caribbean. We are part of the Latin American world and the Latin American culture, and there has always been a presence and interrelations between other parts of Latin America and the Hispanic Caribbean. But as we have, of course, learned from at least from the last 3 decades, the importance of the multiple identities. So it's also very important to realize that the Hispanic Caribbean is also part of the Black Atlantic history, and in that sense, we share with the United States culture, especially with the Black U.S. culture, a lot of elements, and there is also which have made possible some very important dialogues, and really what I would like to focus today is on some areas of this dialogue which have helped shape this what these cultures are today, and you cannot understand them as just separate or antagonic type of culture. There are always been also some kind of dialogue which have been in some moments really very, very important. So you can, of course, interrupt me, and whenever you want to focus on a specific point or to get more information or something that maybe is not well explained. But that was the general idea of what will try to share with you today. First, I would like to well, there were, of course, this the slave plantation societies in the whole Caribbean was extremely linked, and there was a lot of communication between different ports in the Caribbean, and within that one important port city was, of course, New Orleans, which was really a Creole hub. And I mention this because one of the first areas of dialogue that I would like to speak is of jazz. And of course, my presenter, Mark Zimmerman, has taught me a lot about jazz, and he's also welcome to participate. Well, because I will take first jazz, because jazz, jazz has been very, very important in terms of American culture, and of course now is an important element of American culture, which is not strictly limited to black culture, but now. But it was definitely at the beginning a product of black American culture. But always, what I will like you to get that it was always in a strong communication with Hispanic Caribbean culture. In fact, in New Orleans was the birthplace of Jelly Roll Morton, which if you look at the different books on the history of jazz, it's always considered, for example, some phrases I got here. The first great jazz composer, one famous book says. Another famous book said, well, he was the bridge between ragtime and jazz, etc. You know, well, Jelly Roll Morton, which was from New Orleans, but of Haitian origins, background, was known also for his Latin tinge, and always incorporated habaneras in his repertoire. And if you look at the names of the people that were doing jazz or music in general in New Orleans during those years of Jelly Roll Morton, there are a lot of Spanish surnames and names. Some were, of course, people from New Orleans. We don't have the history of all these people, but of many of them we do know that that it was really they came from Puerto Rico, from Cuba, from other places in the Caribbean, the Hispanic Caribbean. So we find that even in the noise I mean in the good sense of noise, the sound is better. The sound of the Dixie jazz bands, they have a lot of instrumental similarities to what Cristóbal Díaz Ayala, the historian of Cuban music, calls the típicas danzoneras. So you have really these relationships from the beginning, but also when jazz orchestras, big bands, started branching out from New Orleans, we have the historical information that many directors used to visit, especially Puerto Rico, because to get musicians. Puerto Rico, because they were U.S. citizens, from 1917 on at least, they were U.S. citizens. Before that, not exactly citizens, but anyway, they could move to the United States without much problem. But also, why they went to Puerto Rico? Because there was a long tradition in the Hispanic Caribbean, a long historical tradition of very popular musicians that who were mostly mulatto musicians, mixed race, which had a very good preparation, in music. They could read good sheet music, they could do well that, because there was this tradition of, it was a sort of a way of going upwards in the social scale, to be a musician. So we had a lot of from the census, for example, the 1868 census in Puerto Rico. We got that there was around 20% people which were classified as black. And within musicians it was 68. So you see, it was a lot of these musicians became in fact, and it's a long tradition of which we don't find only in Puerto Rico. We find also in Cuba, in the Dominican Republic. This tradition of very people who were from popular origins and who were mixed blood. I mean, were what we call mulattoes, but which were very cultured people in terms of they had a very and this was not only music. Our first great painter, was Campeche, who was a mulatto too, and you find that also in Cuba some very important literary figures, and in the Dominican Republic too. Well, historians even. You found that a lot of jazz orchestras went to get musicians, and one of those was Juan Tisol, which became part of the orchestra of Duke Ellington. Duke Ellington said of Juan Tisol, and I quote, "One of the finest musicians I've ever known." That was in his memoirs. So at the end of his life, he said, "Well, one of the finest musicians I've ever known was Juan Tisol." And Tisol did some compositions, and some became standards of jazz. So it was sort of the first glimpses of what later would be called Latin jazz. But it's interesting because it's not sometimes musicians, music history people say, well, the sort of the start of Latin jazz is in 47 with Manteca, which was done by Chano Pozo, and that's part of the relations too with Billy Gillespie. But that's because it's clearly very Latin, type of. Perdido and Caravan are not like that. They are jazz pieces, but we can find there a very strong Latin presence. And I would like to put you an example, because an example I will put, it's only on guitar, so as to take out all percussion instruments and all the kind of things you can identify with Latin music in terms of the sounds of the instrument. So you get sort of the tune, and in that tune, well, you will find sort of the presence of this. You probably have heard it. Perdido. Has perdido. Well, just to get a taste of the, and you probably had heard it because it's a sort of a famous jazz piece, and but you'll find there this dialogue incorporated into jazz. Later, there was this other relation with, and there have been books written. For example, there's a Cuban book by Leonardo Acosta, who's the relationship between jazz and Cuban, specifically Cuban music, and that's very strong. Chico Farrell, which was a Cuban, was the arranger of some of the most important Count Basie, Benny Goodman, Stan Kenton orchestras, So, and you remember, well, probably you don't remember, but later, in the 60, 63 or 64, the album that took the Beatles out of the first in the hit parade was an album called Getz Gilberto, which was a relationship between Stan Getz and Joe and Astro Gilberto. This is Brazilian music, which is very so as to make a long history short of this interrelations with jazz. The Brazilian relation is very important in terms of an element of music that makes Afro-American musics, or what I call mulatto musics, very different from what we call Western music. That is melody is not the king. It's not. I mean, the idea of Western music is that, like many other aspects of the culture, is the notion of sort of the law of gravity. That there's one thing, probably related to monotheism too. It's probably related to that. That there is something that everything has to get into something. You know, if it's social analysis, it can be the mode of production. If it is psychology, it can be the ego. Or even, but there is something. If it is physical science, the law of gravity. In music, melody. And one of the important things, differences of the mulatto music of the America is that there is really a dialogue between melody, rhythm, and harmony, and they don't, and you don't find that the one is over the other in general terms. Sometimes the people from the tradition of the Western music say, well, that the main thing is rhythm, because it's the thing that it stands as a very, it's very important, the development of rhythm as part of the, as part of the music elaboration, not as just an accompaniment. But it's not only rhythm; it can be harmony too, and sometimes it's melody. But there is really an interplay. And with the Brazilian, it's evident. One thing that in jazz was present, but in the Brazilian it's more evident, which is the sort of the protagonism of harmony sometimes. And there was a famous piece by Tom Jobim, which was one of the great composers of Brazil, that had a lot of communication with jazz, which exemplifies this because it's called samba on only one note. Samba on a note, so it's not really on one note. But he makes the point that it sometimes has some long parts which is really on one note, and what the development is whole changes in harmony and changes in rhythm, so that he's making the statement. Well, these two are protagonists of music, and you find this relationship between rhythm, harmony, and melody, not one over the others. You find it also in the most important Hispanic Caribbean music from the late 60s on, salsa. But we will speak about that. And the relationship between jazz is clear. In fact, if you trace the history of the most important protagonists of the salsa movement, or some of the most important protagonists, they all started as young people playing jazz. And there was always this relation, and we will see an example later. But I would like to touch on that a bit later, because first I wanted to see these relations within jazz. I mean, jazz as the very important focus of an element of American culture. But I would like to see a second sphere of this cultural interchange between Latin America, or especially Hispanic Caribbean, with the United States, with the focus on an element on the Hispanic Caribbean culture, and that is the bolero. And the jazz is tremendously important for American culture, and it has been very important for other cultures. Bolero is sort of the music, probably the first music which was considered Latin American, not just Brazilian, not just Cuban, not just Puerto Rican, not just Mexican, but really a Latin American music. Well, that is it has to do with many aspects of the economics of music too. It's the development of boleros as a Latin music is strongly linked to the emergence of the record industry and radio. That's around in the 20s of the 20th century. And it was important to make records which could sell into every country. So there's a lot of this kind of element too. But one very important element of bolero really is that it's a music of people, of migrants. Really, it's music of migrants, people who are moving, and that's why it became very famous in a very small type of ensemble, which was called the trio, where only 3 guitars and 3 people singing, well, probably 2 guitars and a percussion, a maraca or something. Very simple. But in order to be good music for such a small kind of ensemble, well, the guitar instrument was very important, because the guitar really is an instrument which has a lot of possibilities in terms of making harmonies, making rhythm, and making melody, and with a great sound register. But very important was to the relation of voices. I mean, having what they call in music the first voice. I don't know if you use that word in English too. In Spanish we use la primera voz, la segunda, la tercera, first voice, second voice. Well, persons, having three people singing, and they are doing different things, not singing just the same thing, so that they make harmonies, and so it gets richer, and very important for that, for the emergence of that type of sound in bolero, was the fact that this dialogue with U.S. Black America. Rafael Hernandez, which was a Puerto Rican, he used to first he was a player of the trombone, but then he was drafted for the U.S. Army, and as many institutions there at that time, that was in the First World War, these institutions were segregated in terms of color, so he went to the black. And then there are a lot of evidence that he became very much involved with the black musicians in the spiritual, this kind of, they have a lot of working with a lot of voices, in the U.S. black tradition. So that was very important for the development of that type of bolero. Rafael Hernandez was, of course, one of the first great bolero writers, composers, and it's also we don't have studied a lot of many other things yet, I mean, all these things that I'm presenting to you now is things that I think have to be studied more, these relations, these dialogues. But the fact is that if you take in 1930, for example, if you take which were the 6 more important composers of boleros, you'll find that 4 of them have had the experience of living in New York. And you know, were probably living in New York or had this experience. Rafael Hernandez, of course, the Puerto Rican, but also Nilo Melendez, which was one of the author of Aquellos Ojos Verdes, a Cuban, and a very important Cuban composer. And then 2 Mexicans, Maria Greber, the most important woman composer at the time. She went to live in New York and never returned to Mexico to live. She returned to Mexico, you know, and she wanted to be buried in Mexico when she died, but she didn't want to live in Mexico. You know, she wanted to tell you she was, you know, doing boleros and speaking about love and understanding. She could do that in New York. You can imagine in 1925 trying to do that in Mexico. It was not very difficult, not very simple for a woman. Maria Greber, then, well, she lived in New York. Guti Cárdenas sometimes lived in New York, sometimes in Yucatan, sometimes in Mexico City, you know. So it's very important, this element. And also, the fact that in terms of trios, which are this very small ensemble, the music of trios, which sort of became almost a stereotype of Latin America, and sometimes, well, the most famous of all these trios was called Los Panchos. Probably you heard music from Los Panchos. Los Panchos was formed in New York. So it was formed in New York. It was 2 Mexicans and 1 Puerto Rican living in New York. They formed Los Panchos. So a lot of times it's not mentioned as this fact, you know, and it's well, maybe to put another musical example, maybe we can put an example of a piece by Rafael Hernandez and a trio. But as I look at here, if you want to make a question or something.
I have a quick question.
Good.
So does music follow, for instance, when you talked about the 40s and the 50s, sort of the same trend, for instance, in the visual, the plastic arts, and where a lot of artists were either moving to Europe or coming to the States and sort of grasping some of the movements here, but completely transforming them when they went back to, let's say, the Caribbean or South America? Is that, you know, since that was going with art and literature, did the music, in your opinion, was the same, sort of took that same path?
Well, not exactly, because in the graphic arts we find most of the people that had this experience, you know, were sort of in an art world which was considered sort of high culture. In terms of music, we have that also that kind of relation with the music that were composed in sort of classical music. But in these examples I'm giving are more as part of the popular culture. So this relation with the U.S. culture was part of their sort of their lives, you know, in a way, as life as migrants, but not exactly as part of a musical movement. In fact, most of them became famous, you know, after that, having had that experience. But there are that's a very interesting thing you mentioned, and I'm almost looking here. Apparently I didn't get well. Here. I'm going to put one which I don't find it now. Well, let's continue, because later it's better to have it all put it down. But I didn't do that job before. But what we were saying is very important in terms of another type of relationship which should be explored too. We should be explored. A lot of artists, graphic artists, came and musicians, had this experience of coming to United States, and especially it's very interesting because before sort of in terms of graphic art, for example, really the United States was not considered a major area until the famous New York School of 1940 something, 44 or something like that. New York abstract, abstract expressionist. But anyway, what you had was a lot of, for example, the muralists, the Mexican muralists that did come to New York, but not as they sort of impacted New York more than got from New York. It's a sort of an area of relationship that it's very important to analyze, to see, because some of the Pollack, for example, was part of the Siqueiro experimental workshop. When they became famous doing another thing, there was still some element of the impact of the great Mexican muralists. Only the fact of doing big things, trying to do murals in a way, or doing big things, but also in terms of the type of expression in the color and this kind of thing. Yes, a lot of that's a very important aspect too that should be studied more carefully. Well, the other two aspects that I wanted to, or spheres that I wanted to mention to you, are related to what is called youth culture in terms of music, which will be salsa and hip hop. Because these first two, which I was speaking, jazz and bolero, this aspect of sort of generational aspect was not considered very important at the beginning. It was sort of it was there were other elements entering into or other elements there present, and one aspect which we have to have in mind, which it's always a great tension within the culture of music, is this element of the expression of some sentiments vis-a-vis the sort of the entertainment industry, and it's very important because we cannot forget that from 1919, I think it was, until 1934, there was this the prohibition of alcohol in the United States, which was very important for the development of the gangs, you know, the Al Capone and the mafia world. And this. Well, Cuba was very close. Cuba, Havana became very important as part of the entertainment world of the United States. You know, was so close, and it was so much penetrated by the mafia and this kind of thing that really Latin music developed in that period in the cabarets of La Habana. Sort of became part of the sort of a stereotype of Latin music, you know, and it's at the same time there were people doing boleros and this kind of thing, you know, speaking about the depression or love linked to depression in terms of the economic depression and a lot of things, very important social things that were happening. But this element of the entertainment industry and so much linked to had an impact in the time of sound the music will get, and an element which has not been studied enough, which is how do the jazz bands sound. I mean, this type of organization, you know, with the different types of instruments, and sort of became the type of model for a lot of the other dance music social dance music in the world, and a lot through the Latin American dance orchestras. They adopted this kind of thing with some difference that we will speak later, but the sort of the big band, what they call the big band, became very similar to the jazz big band, the Latin big band, and at the moment by the early 50s, where we had also another important thing that was happening in the world, which was of course the emergence of the U.S. as the big power in the world, you know, after the Second World War, and there was a great investment in Latin America at the moment, and a great cultural investment too. Movies that dealt with Latin America in 1940. I don't remember the exact figure, but there were something, and in 3 years they went 3 times. And most of them spoke about this stereotype of the entertainment industry, the Latin type of Carmen Miranda telling the admirals, which had a lot of things to do with gender too. You know, the American as the Latino as the woman, and the Carmen Miranda telling these admirals, well, there is the good neighbor policy. Come, let's good neighbor it. And, you know, if I was the Uncle Samba, let's do the Uncle Samba. Yes. Yeah. So it was a part of that. But what we get is that some of the big orchestras, Latin orchestras, which were considered as the great Latin orchestras, were the Machito one, which was directed by Mario Bazar, was more of the Cubans. There was the Noro Morales, there was the Tito Puente, Tito Rodriguez, and 2 directed by Catalan, Javier Cugat and Eric Madriguera. All these were in New York. all these bands. Well, the famous Latin music that was going through the bands was going through New York. Most of them. There was some other big important orchestras in Latin America, but this was one considered by all people in Latin America important bands, and the development of the idea of Latin was very much a part of that of those bands, which of course had to play a lot of things from a lot of places in Latin America, so that the other aspects before sort of presenting a general picture that we can then have more interchange is this what I said at the moment later, that was the youth movements, which were of course reacting to that sort of stereotypes, and as the jazz and the bolero in these other movements that I would like to mention, there is one more clearly Latin, which was salsa, and another more identified with U.S. black culture, which is hip hop. But both, in both, there was a very strong dialogue, really, between Hispanic, Caribbean, and U.S. black culture. In those, though, one is more identified with Latin and another more identified with the Black American culture. And in this I hope to find to see in salsa the presence of jazz and jazz type of expressions. It's very clear, and we'll put an example of Willie Colon, which was one from New York, which was one of the most important musicians in salsa. This is a very interesting song because it's a song by a Brazilian. It's originally a Brazilian song, and it's called Noche Criolla, which criolla means sort of native, Creole. It's Brazilian originally, but then he make it more. I wanted to go and say, so if you will hear. So I get into the middle of the song. Y que me importa que me puedan quemar en tu fuego. Me voy pa'l monte con mi querida, es que quiero guarachar con la gata mía. Ay, pero vámonos ya, vida mía, que venga la alegría. Usually salsa has a first part of song, then a part of communication between the soloist and the other, and then a part of instrumental jam station, sort of, which is what we hear now. The first is with a cuatro, the first. Well, I think you get the idea now, which that it's very clear the presence of the jam these jam sessions of jazz, this movement from these different instruments, and also the idea of giving each instrument, and even those which are low graded in Western music standards, like the bass or like the drums, or like the cuatro, and this kind of, also in the Puerto Rican one, giving them the opportunity to develop their virtuosity, understand? But it's, in that sense, it has a lot of communication with the jazz tradition of giving also these instruments the opportunity to have their, yes.
Oh, I was just going to mention, I usually travel a lot to New York, and my husband and I go to a lot of Latin clubs, and there's one in particular that we go, the Blue Note in the Village, and it's when they have Latin jazz, it's very interesting, which I love, is they have two sessions. They'll have the first session, which being salsa and sung, and then the second session is the Latin jazz. And I saw Oscar de Leon play there, and he was, his Latin jazz session, which was just purely jazz, was amazing.
Yes.
But I thought that was interesting how they sort of did one session with salsa and the other session with being all jazz.
Yes, if, I know you want to comment too, because it's very clear the present that now that of course the way of understanding the dialogue between these cultures from the Ariel Caliban perspective, you cannot understand that, of seeing really how much present there is one thing in the other. Yes.
I had a question. You mentioned the ties between like African cultures and the Caribbean cultures. What were the influences of Spain? Like, I think flamenco, but I don't really hear flamenco in this. I know that some flamenco music, like the guajiras and stuff, have been influenced by Cuba, but I wanted to know if it went the other way.
Yes, no, very, very, very strong too. Very, very important. Usually the Latin American cultures have usually been seen as with a continuous dialogue with Spain. So that I wanted to focus on while I will going to speak with you with these relations also with United States culture, especially U.S. black culture, because that's what is usually not considered, but the question is good because in terms of Spain, also there is a very important relation and communication with different aspects of Spanish culture, and the Hispanic Caribbean had a very important relation with the flamenco. Because it was part of the ethnic problematic in a way, because as part we are of the sort of the downgrade of our black ancestry, African ancestry, but the flamenco is also very downgraded in Spain. Now it's sort of accepted as very important, but traditionally it has always been looked down, because it was sort of another, the gypsies and this kind of thing, and then, but nevertheless there have been strong relations in terms of in two ways. One is speaking of to continue the musical dialogue. One is the relationship between the sort of the instruments and the dancers. That's a very interesting thing, because the Western tradition, what it became of the Western tradition, because the Western tradition is of course very long historically, but what became is that usually the dancers dance to the music. Now in the flamenco, as in a lot of black traditions in the Caribbean, the dancer and the music are always in an interchange. It's not that the dancers are dancing to the music, but that in a way what the music is going to be is a lot of what the dancers are doing too. So a lot of what the dancers do in the flamenco then make what the people who's playing the guitar is going to how he's going to shift his emphasis in the guitar, and the same thing goes with the dancers and the drums. You know, in a lot of our more African present type of music, and also another element is the element of what we call the clave, which is very important. Is the sort of the time. Usually the Western music became sort of more standardized in very simple time forms. I mean, 2/4 or 3/4. With 1 2 3 1 2 3 or 1 2 1 2. And we have a sort of a more elaborate time figures, because they are where the different sort of beats are not all the same, and you don't always stress on the first beat, which is the type of the European say 1 2 3 1 2 3, which were the claves and the claves, and the flamenco uses a kind of clave which they do with the feet, and it's also a clave with different stops and different time figures and also the emphasis. So it's there are a lot of dialogues there too, which we have to be considering what is going to be another way of thinking about music, and we will return to that. But let's go a bit to the hip hop tradition, because from the beginning, probably you know a lot about more than I do about the hip hop. Maybe, I don't know, but the hip hop from the beginning is interesting, because they always spoke about that they were a culture. They used this word, part of the hip hop culture. That's not a thing that analysts have put into hip hop. I mean, the hip hop people speak about the hip hop culture. So, and it's interesting because they saw that there was a combination of different types of expressions, and that combined with life form, with lifestyles, and it was not only music, but there were other elements. And music was divided into two parts of elements. What they call the MC, which is the sort of the people who do the rap. Well, the master of ceremony. MC comes from master of ceremony, and it was the person who did the sort of the talking. And the DJ, which is of course the person who is doing the combination of musics. And that is, of course, the music made out of music. The music made sort of accepting the reality of the mechanical sounds, of the importance of the mechanical sounds. And then there was also the element of the dance, which was originally called the b-boying, and the element of the graphic part, the graffiti, and so it's all part. They also consider all this part of the hip hop culture. And if you study the different elements, there's the Latino presence in this history is very clear. For example, the b-boying, well, the most famous b-boying were the Puerto Ricans in the Bronx, Puerto Rican. But of course there were a lot of other b-boys. And in the graffiti culture, there was a very, very important tradition too of, in the, as you see here in Houston, and very of the Mexican murals. Well, there was also in New York the importance of the mostly Puerto Rican murals there, and the fact that of course graffiti have attained already a sort of museum status. But it's interesting that one of these artists who attained museum status was half Haitian, half Puerto Rican, Basquiat, and Jean-Michel Basquiat, and there was also another one which attained it was Haring, which was an American, a white American. But if you see at the life of his life, he had 3 partners in his life, and or 3 or 4, and all were Latin and mostly Latin, mulatto Latin, that's Latin. So you see the kind of the people he was hanging with. So it was part of this culture. But also you find, of course, very important, some important MCs and DJs too. But in that aspect, of course, the black musicians have been are the ones who have attained more world renown until very recently, that sort of the return of the sort of the couple dance, sort of the couple dance in the hip hop, and the development of what is being called the reggaeton, which have attained a lot of popularity in the world. But that's a very recent phenomenon. I mean, 5 years, more or less 5-6 years. But in the reggaeton, of course, a lot of elements of Caribbean music get into, and a lot of dialogue with salsa. And I will put you an example too, so that you will have an idea of recent reggaeton. And this is by one who was it's called Daddy Yankee. That's the nickname. Of course, this has another name. He had a real name. Yeah. But he was very famous because of one piece called La Gasolina. Was very famous in Europe and everywhere.
It was when the prices really got high.
But this is a piece where it's more clearly his relationship with salsa. And in fact, a salsero will be participating there. you got an example there. Well, really, the traditional way of seeing sort of these big separations in terms of culture, of the Latin American culture and U.S. culture, in terms of the Caribbean, it is really we will learn more about of what jazz, bolero, Latin jazz, hip hop, and reggaeton will tell us that that this kind of traditional division. So that's what I think the academics have a lot to learn from these traditions in terms of really what are these cultural interchanges. And of course, it has been Hispanic Caribbean with U.S. black culture, but Hispanic Caribbean culture is very, very important culture of Latin American culture, and U.S. black culture is a very, very important part of U.S. culture. So if you try to divide them, in as the as the intellectual critiques were doing in the early 20th century, and still that tradition is very strong, then you will never be able to really understand what is going on and the possibilities that emerge from that dialogue, because from that dialogue, I think it has emerged a type of way of expressing in musical terms, which has a lot of possibilities in terms of another kind of relationship between people, which means a lot of things in terms of what is usually termed as sociology, a lot of things in terms of politics, a new kind of life. I think there is a lot of theory to be done of this, of what I call the mulatto musics. I know it's not a good word in English, but really I don't like it to say the black music, because I always use mulattoes hyphen, because it's not a biological thing, of course, but it's this combination really of African and European traditions, and some things new that emerged from that, and especially of that dialogues that have been taken in the different mulatto cultures in the Americas, which have a sort of brought the possibility of a type of expression that combines a lot of elements that the dominant Western tradition have been separating. That, for example, the relationship between song and dance, the relationship between individual expression and communication, the relationship between improvisation and composition, the relationship between what is communication and what is expression. I think there is another way of looking at these realities, which of course have to do with a lot of things in terms of daily life, that are expressed through these musics in their dialogues. I think that's what sort of the general thing. But now I would like to have more a dialogue with you too. Okay, I don't know.
The several things that you talked about, and some of the questions that were asked that rang a few bells for me. One was the relationship with Spanish melodies as well as certain Spanish rhythms that become part of the tradition, which I think the tradition you're really talking about, maybe it's wrong, you could characterize it as kind of urban reactions to slave societies coming from people who were the sons and daughters of slaves, and then the people they began to influence, which could have been Italians, Jews, everybody else who might have been around them. Certainly in New Orleans, there were a lot of Italian musicians who ended up playing the music of New Orleans and developing different forms. But I think that's what you're saying, in effect, that even though not all of Latin America or even the Caribbean was plantation society, there's a relationship to the kinds of forms that stayed from Africa and then changed in slavery and then became part of these newer traditions developing that are all kind of urban traditions. And in the middle of that, one thing that you didn't talk about that almost every time you talk about these things you have to deal with is to what degree, say, salsa is Cuban or Puerto Rican or something else, and the kind of movement from one group to another or one culture to another. I was really interested to hear the example of De Leon from Venezuela mixed into that also. And in that respect, to my mind, there is a transition from the music of the bands and a lot of the jazz, even into bebop, which has to do with the movement, and I've told you this before, from the trumpet, which was primary in Cuban, I think, tropical music, to the trombone, which of course became Willie Colon's thing, and which really, to me, changed the sound of tropical music in a lot of ways to make it something more Puerto Rican, more close to what was happening in New York, which was, and of course Tizol was a trombone player, but he played a what do you call valve trombone, whereas a lot of the other trombone music used to be slide trombone, which sort of suggests sliding from one kind of cultural element to another. So those are just some reflections I had listening to the talk today.
Yes. No, it's very interesting. Maybe we can have some other reflections and then so as not to, and I'll try to get into all of them.
I don't know if this is correct or not, but I guess I would like to know if I'm right in thinking that these kind of non-Western musical movements were more subculture movements or part of popular culture, or maybe something that was more underground that became popular culture as I guess the U.S. became more multicultural, or if this was kind of an underground movement of music.
Well, maybe we can take these two and then another ones, because they are all, both of them have a lot of important elements which I may forget. Yes, I think it's really a process. It's really a very all these are historical processes. That's why I'm a strong advocate of studying history. I think they are all historical processes which point also to possible changes in terms of future too. And one of the important elements of what we were discussing in that sense is how this music that is part of what is considered popular music and it's linked to entertainment industries and this kind of thing. Well, it's almost finishing the time. It gets into the possibility of turning into a very sophisticated and very high culture, not considered high culture, but considered as analysts as high culture. What we see today, one of the most elaborated music, really, in terms salsa and Latin jazz are one of the most elaborated music. I mean, in terms of elaboration, you can compare it with a lot of elements of classical music. And in fact, they incorporated a lot of elements of classical music. This classical music tradition. I mean, and so they make something new, and they make something new with a different kind of vision too. With a vision, and in that sense, it's important, this element that it's a music that is not from one particular nation. Salsa is from different nations, really, a combination of nations, but it's pointed to this element, this very, very important element, that the most important thing within the expression, the sonorous expression, is the communication.